I'm Dr. Anthony Harper here, blessed to be with Yoram Ettinger. And Mr. Ettinger, thank you for joining me today. You are with the Ettinger Report, and to tell our listeners a little bit about your Ettinger Report and a website that you have.
Well, the Ettinger Report is the result of my experience as a retired ambassador, a diplomat, a researcher. I headed the Middle East Research Unit in the Israeli Civil Service for about 10 years. I was in charge of Israel's congressional relations at the Israeli Embassy in Washington. I was Israel's Consul General to the southwestern states based in Texas. I was the director of the Israeli Government Press Office, which coordinates ties with foreign journalists in Israel. And for the last 30 years, I have been writing weekly articles, speaking, interviewed on Israeli and American television, visiting the US Congress 3, sometimes 5 times a year, and focusing on US-Israel relations and Middle East affairs.
Okay, and your website that you have is what?
The Ettinger Report, which highlights what's in it for America. I emphasize the U.S. concern, threats to U.S. interests, rather than Israeli concerns.
Okay, the website address is for our audience. What website address can they go to?
www.theettingerreport.com, Ettinger with double T.
Okay. Well, thank you for joining me to talk about these serious issues regarding Israel-U.S. relations policy. So the number one concern you have about a rift between U.S. policy and Israeli policy would be what?
Well, it seems to me that the key point of contention is the proposed Palestinian state, which has been embraced enthusiastically by the State Department for decades now, while Israel has its reservations. From my point of view, the State Department is following a policy which is self-destructive, undermining American interests. Suffice to say that while the State Department is enthusiastic about the proposed Palestinian states, the Arab attitude, and especially the attitude by the pro-US Arab countries, is anywhere from indifferent to negative towards the idea of a Palestinian state. And one can sum up suggesting that while the Arab talk, and I emphasize Arab talk, has embraced the Palestinians, the Arab walk has been quite different, anywhere from indifference towards the Palestinian, towards negative. Arabs have refrained from acting tangibly on behalf of Palestinian state.
What happens if the U.S., the Biden administration, threatens Israel to remove military support for if they don't go along with this Palestinian state idea?
Well, we're talking about an issue which is a prerequisite for Israel's survival, namely Israel's control of the mountain ridges of Judea and Samaria is a prerequisite for Israel's security in the explosive volcanic Middle East, as it has been volcanic region for the last 14 centuries. When one hears the State Department talking about two states peacefully coexisting side by side, one should ask, what is exactly the track record that has led the State Department to assume that this is a realistic solution. What has been the track record of the Palestinian leadership, which has convinced the State Department that the Palestinian leadership are amenable to peaceful coexistence? Certainly, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Egypt, Jordan, Morocco do not share that view unless you assess the Arab position in accordance with their talk. But the Arab walk has been all along pretty negative on the issue of a Palestinian state. And the reason is very simple: the Palestinian track record. The State Department bases its attitude towards the idea of a Palestinian state on Palestinian diplomatic and media talk, which is very, very moderate, obviously. The Arabs, on the other hand, do not care much about the Palestinian talk. They are concerned about the Palestinian walk, and not towards Israel, but the Palestinian walk in the intra-Arab arena. And when one examines the Palestinian track record in the intra-Arab arena, one notices that in the early 1950s, Egypt allowed the Palestinians to terrorize Israel from Gaza. Within a year, the Palestinians joined forces with Muslim Brotherhood terrorists in Egypt, terrorizing their host government, and they had to run away from Egypt. Syria absorbed them, allowing them to terrorize Israel, but by mid-1960s, they joined forces with the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood, terrorizing Syria, and they had to run away to Jordan. In Jordan, by 1970, they tried to topple their host regime, the pro-American Hashemite regime, which triggered a civil war, and they had to run away from Jordan to Lebanon. They plundered Lebanon for 5 years, and then they tried to take over Beirut, which again yielded series of civil wars, and it lasted until the Palestinian leadership had to run away from Lebanon in 1982. And then came Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait, which was at that time the most generous host of Palestinians. Some 400,000 Palestinians were absorbed by them. But when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, the Palestinians joined the invasion against their own very generous host country. And the conclusion by every single pro-American Arab regime is that the Palestinian state, based on its track record, in addition to being very close to North Korea, Venezuela, Cuba, Russia, China, in addition to training terrorists from Africa and Asia, Europe and Latin America, the Arabs are convinced that such a track record guarantees that the Palestinian state would add fuel to the fire in the Middle East, threatening each moderate Arab regime, and therefore they embrace the Palestinians via talk, but they refrain from any tangible work on behalf of Palestinian state.
What can Israel do if many of the nations of the world stand against Israel, refuse to support Israel military in any way, holding them hostage basically if they won't agree with this Palestinian state idea, which our audience kind of sees as kind of a delusional idea. But what can Israel do as far as being militarily independent from other countries so that they're not in this compromised situation?
Well, pressure on Israel is not something new. as they say, it ain't the first time, ain't the last time, and ain't the worst time. We have prevailed under much, much more severe pressure from 1948 until today. Moreover, it's true that the State Department is pressuring Israel. Both chambers of Congress do not. And both chambers of Congress are co-equal, co-determining to the administration as far as shaping, as far as conducting domestic and foreign policy and national security. From my own experience, vast majority in the House and in the Senate would not go along with such pressure by the President and the Secretary of State. And we have witnessed in the past conflicts, confrontation between the executive branch of government, the legislature branch of government, and the legislature has proven itself to be able to flex a very, very formidable muscle, especially when it comes to Israel. And first and foremost, this is not merely an Israeli issue, it's an American issue, because a Palestinian state west of the river would doom the pro-US Hashemite regime east of the river, would transform Jordan into a chaotic, into a lawless state, an arena for multitude of Islamic terror organizations, which would create ripple effects southward into the Arabian Peninsula, and that would put to risk every single pro-American Arab oil-producing country, the Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, all the way, by the way, to Egypt and Jordan. This would be a bonanza. A Palestinian state would be a bonanza for the Ayatollahs of Iran, for China, for Russia. It would extend the footprint of those rivals and enemies of the US. It would jeopardize global trade, would be quite a blow to American economy, but also to the American homeland security, because it would lend a very bolstered tailwind to Islamic terrorism, which aims at bringing the US to submission.
Have you heard of this? Is very important for a lot of our audience. Is there's a Jewish scripture in the Jewish prophet Joel, chapter 3, verse 2, that warns against any scattering of the Jewish people and dividing up the land. This is a key Jewish scripture that has motivated a lot of evangelical Christians to oppose a Palestinian state.
Well, I'm aware of that, but it seems to me that the impact of a Palestinian state is not limited only to historical, religious issues. It has to do with real and clear threats to American interests, to American homeland security, and every Christian, believing Christian or secular Christian in America should know that a Palestinian state would severely undermine American interest, would pose an immediate threat to every single pro-American Arab regime, and would be leveraged very, very impressively by every single enemy and rival of the United States. The problem is that the State Department has decided to replace Middle East reality with an alternative reality of all countries peacefully coexisting side by side. I wish it would be true, but as I mentioned, one needs to highlight the track record of the Palestinians to realize that a Palestinian state would not be prone to peaceful coexistence but in fact would be prone to further terrorism, further instability, to the satisfaction of Russia and China and the Ayatollahs of Iran, and to the detriment of the United States.
What kind of a response was there in Israel when former President Trump and Jared Kushner came out with a peace plan that showed a Palestinian state in the heartland of Israel? You may have seen the map. I don't know how many Israelis people saw that map that they came out with January 28, 2020, of the dividing of Israel, the Palestinian state, the vision for peace to prosperity, or something to that effect. But do you know what kind of response was that? Very well known about this map dividing Israel with a Palestinian state?
Well, I cannot talk on behalf of Israel. I don't represent Israel, but I can only state that I opposed that plan from the minute it became known publicly, because once again, a Palestinian state is not only a prerequisite for the destruction of Israel. A Palestinian state is an element which would severely undermine America's own interest and advance the interest of America's rivals and enemies. I'm aware that the people who introduced that plan contended that the Palestinians would have to accept a series of preconditions in order to justify them receiving sovereignty over a state. And I thought then, and I think now, that the idea of preconditions is pretty naive. It's naive because it doesn't matter what the introduction of those preconditions has in mind. What matters is the application in reality. And we have been through a series of agreements with the Palestinians. When they accepted series of preconditions, they did not abide by any of them. But American presidents and European leaders and the UN all rushed to the defense of the Palestinians, explaining to the Israelis that it should take some time before preconditions were adhered to. In principle, a Palestinian state west of the Jordan River would doom the pro-American Hashemite regime in Jordan east of the river, and consequently threaten the existence of every single pro-American Arab regime. And in my mind, this is a self-destructive American policy. This is not a viable American policy.
A big question that I have, and I know many of the evangelical Christian audience have, is why would former President Trump even agree to this idea, promote this map showing a Palestinian state in the heartland of Israel? What was in it for former President Trump and for the U.S. to have this peace plan map? Was it a requirement for the Abraham Accords to happen? Do you know some of the reasons that went into why former President Trump would agree to this in the first place?
It had nothing to do with the Abraham Accords, because the plan was not implemented. The plan was, in fact, rejected, and the Abraham Accords followed the introduction of that plan after it was not implemented. The Abraham Accords is a testimony that the Palestinian issue is not the crux of the Arab-Israeli conflict, is not a crown jewel of Arab policymakers, because Israel has by now peace accords with 6 Arab countries. 4 of them are the Abraham Accords. None of the 6 peace accords with Israel was preconditioned upon establishing a Palestinian state. All 6 peace accords have bypassed the Palestinian issue and therefore came to fruition, unlike the litany of peace proposals by the State Department. All of them were crashed against the rocks of Middle East reality for one reason. State Department always has presented peace plans which center around the Palestinian issue. The Palestinian issue is not the center or interest of any Arab country. Arab countries are not going to sacrifice their interest on the altar of the Palestinian issue. In fact, they have realized that the Palestinian leadership is acting against their own Arab interests. The Saudis do not have peace accord with Israel, but the defense cooperation, commercial cooperation is at an all-time high without a Palestinian state. It has reached such level because the Saudis have concluded defense relations, agriculture relations, irrigation relations, high-tech relations with Israel promote Saudi interests, and they do not subordinate their own Saudi interests to the Palestinians.
So Saudi Arabia is not on board with actually to willing to join the Abraham Accords unless, from my understanding, they agree to that Israel agrees to a Palestinian state. Saudi Arabia seems to be preoccupied with this delusional idea that a Palestinian state issue has to be agreed upon. Saudi Arabia seems to be in rejection of cooperation with Israel. What would you say to that?
It's true only if you assume that the Saudi talk reflects the Saudi walk. But the Saudi walk on the Palestinian issue is 180 from the Palestinian talk. And I'll give you one example. On November 11, the Saudis hosted a joint summit of the Arab League and the international Islamic countries. During that summit on November 11, 2023, at the height of the war against Hamas in Gaza, the Palestinians, Iran, and Algeria proposed a resolution which would end right away all diplomatic, financial, touristic, and defense ties with Israel. That resolution was defeated by Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates and Morocco and Egypt and Jordan and few other non-Arab Muslim countries. And that is the reflection of the Saudi walk. You go back to all Israeli confrontations with the Palestinians, whether it's the PLO or Hamas, during none of them did the Saudis or any Arab country flex a military muscle, hardly financial muscle. They did flex the verbal muscle, but not the tangible, real muscle, which could have made a difference. And the reason, again, the Saudis, unlike the State Department, pay attention to the Palestinian track record, which has transformed the Palestinians into the role model of intra-Arab subversion, intra-Arab terrorism, intra-Arab ingratitude, and intra-Arab treachery. And the Arabs do not forget and do not forgive, and therefore do not flex their muscles on behalf of the Palestinians.
Do you think the idea of a Palestinian state would be more accepted if the Palestinian Authority were better at making their citizens independent? From my knowledge, that the Palestinian Authority, they don't have their own factories. They're not energy independent. They really don't have any real business structure like Israel has in any way. So that has been a big issue that I have seen. And I just wanted your response to, would that make a huge difference if the Palestinian Authority were really independent and could be producing and not dependent on handouts from so many other nations? So,
well, it has been the Western view of the Middle East that you can approach it as if Western values, Western institutions are applicable to the Middle East. And one of those values is the Western notion of money talks. Neither the Ayatollahs of Iran nor the Palestinians are willing to subordinate their ideology, their strategy to money, to financial benefits. The US has showered the Ayatollahs of Iran with hundreds of billions of dollars under the delusion that this would induce them to accept peaceful coexistence, and with their Arab Sunni neighbors, this would induce them also to accept good faith negotiation and abandon their fanatic religious 1400-year-old ideology. The same thing with the Palestinians. The US, the West, and Israel have showered the Palestinians with financial bonanza and diplomatic bonanza, but that has not changed the Palestinian focus on their own vision, on their own ideology, which has nothing to do with the size of Israel. It has to do with the existence of Israel. A prerequisite for the Palestinians to advance their goal is the elimination of Israel. And to assume that if they have higher standard of living, if they have better education and better welfare, they would also shelve and abandon their ideology is detached from Middle East reality among the Palestinians as it is in Iran among the Ayatollahs. They do not allow the notion of money talks to transcend their ideology. They stick to their ideology, and they derive much encouragement when they see the State Department supporting, in fact, the Ayatollahs of Iran, supporting the Palestinians, while ignoring the fundamental vision that drives both the Ayatollahs and the Palestinians.
Are you saying that because they're getting all these handouts, they get all this money given to them, there's no incentive for the Palestinian Authority to be independent, to really be responsible, or here in America, they say, we hear, get a job, be responsible. So you think that could be one of the reasons, because they're getting all this money showered, they get all this help, that there's no incentive for them to be responsible and be, have their own industry whatsoever?
The Palestinian leadership does not consider being independent, getting a job as the top priority. The top overriding central priority has always been to what they call freeing Palestine from the sovereignty of the infidel Jew or from the Zionist entity. And the Western delusions that they could change that attitude by providing the Palestinians more economic prosperity, more educational enlightenment, has nothing to do with the Middle East. And the West is determined to learn from history by repeating mistakes. Back in 1979, it was the US, then President Jimmy Carter, which assumed that supporting the Ayatollahs in order to topple the very, very pro-American Shah of Iran would secure the friendship of the Ayatollahs. And he learned very fast that rogue regimes, rogue terrorists do bite the hand that feeds them. And as we know, Iran was transformed very quickly into the #1 epicenter of anti-American terrorism and anti-American drug trafficking and anti-American money laundering. And the same applies to the Palestinians. If you go back and you ask yourself, what is the Palestinian vision? Well, we find out that in 1959, 8 years before Israel reunited Jerusalem, 8 years before Israel returned to Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, the Palestinians already made it clear that their vision is to free Palestine from Jewish presence. Later on in 1964, there was the charter of the PLO, which is headed by the Mahmoud Abbas, which is the authority above the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah. And in 1964, the charter specified ending the survival of the Jewish state. All this took place before we came back to Judea, Samaria, and this has nothing to do with the level of economy and education and welfare and transportation in the West Bank or in Gaza. The West needs to adjust itself to the fact that Middle East is not roving around Western values. Middle East adheres to Middle Eastern values. And in the Middle East, the notion of concluding peace or ceasefire with a so-called infidel means very, very short-lived temporary ceasefire or peace. And therefore, we concluded many negotiations with Hamas in the past, and every negotiation served as a springboard for Hamas to become stronger and stronger until they hit us horrifically on October 7 as a result of Israel adhering to the faulty Western view of the Middle East, making itself believe that if we only allow more Gazans to work in Israel, if we only allow more money to come into Gaza, that is going to minimize terrorism. The opposite is true. The more concessions you make to terrorist and rogue regimes, the more you whet their appetite, and the more they dare in terrorizing their benefactor. We saw it not too long ago with the US, which was the major factor helping the Mujahideen to evict the Soviets out of Afghanistan. What was the Mujahideen response? They joined September 11 terrorism in New York. The US helped the Ayatollahs to take over control of Iran. What was their response? That once again, they did bite the hand that feeds them by taking over the American embassy and holding over 50 Americans hostages for 444 days. And last and not least, we saw the US leading an all-out NATO military war campaign against Gaddafi of Libya, helping the opposition to Gaddafi, which was Islamic terrorist in Libya. And once the US-led NATO offensive against Gaddafi was successful and Gaddafi was lynched by the Islamic terrorists, the next thing they did was they lynched the American consul general in Benghazi in Libya, in addition to 2 more Americans. And the question is, how many times the US and Israel have to go through critical errors in the context of their ties with Iran and the Palestinians to realize that the Ayatollahs and the Palestinians do not succumb to money talk. They focus on fanatic, religious, ideological vision, which has no room, not for what they call the great American Satan, and not for what they call the beachhead of the American Satan in the Middle East, namely Israel.
It sounds like a real history of stupid behavior, of believing that the Palestinians would really be responsible. Then they're not willing to give up. You're saying they're not willing to give up whatsoever their hate of the Jewish people. Neither is the Ayatollah. So there's a lot to learn from this lesson. Hopefully, people will learn from history that we will be doomed to repeat it. I know there's a lot more information that we can talk about on this, and your website has more about this Palestinian state idea. You once again invite people to look at your website. We can carry on this conversation again to get into some deeper issues that are happening there. And until then, people can look at your website. They can sign up for your newsletter as well. For your website address again is
www.theettingerreport.com, Ettinger with double T.
Well, thank you, Mr. Ettinger, for joining me. And these are very crucial issues. And I will look forward to talking with you again for some more in-depth analysis of these issues.
Very much.